But yeah, so when you and I last talked, it was about ICE. It was about what was going on in Arkansas. We hadn't seen it up until that point, and now we're seeing it, seems like all across the country, now in Minnesota. So I guess from a legal perspective, I mean, what's going on out there?
Well, I mean, I think that's what everyone's trying to figure out. I mean, as kind of a threshold matter, ICE is not a traditional police agency in the sense that they're a criminal law enforcement agency enforcing criminal law. They're a civil code law enforcement agency, so they're tasked with enforcing civil law, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which the vast majority of infractions that they're enforcing against are not actual, criminal law violations. So, what we're seeing in the community would be similar to the Security and Exchange Commission uh, suspecting somebody and turning their street into a war zone. So, what we're seeing is not by any stretch of the imagination normal. Even as we've seen ICE as an agency become increasingly militarized over the course of the last several years.
Now, thinking about what happened in Minnesota. I guess it was last weekend where the woman was killed by ICE. And, I think frankly, you could probably make an argument both sides. Was she trying to hit the guy? Was she not? I mean, that's another discussion, of course. But, you know, as a lawyer, I haven't heard anything about that particular, there's nothing that's come out that I've seen about that particular agent, who he is, what's happened to him. Is there an investigation into him? So from, again, a legal perspective, I mean, how do you go if you're representing maybe that family, how do you go about this situation?
I mean, if I were representing the family, I would certainly want to see an investigation by some authority, the federal government, or the state of Minnesota, just so we could get an idea of what actually happened and if he actually violated procedure. At this point, what you have are two dramatically competing narratives. One from the federal government itself that is essentially labeled Miss Good as a domestic terrorist, and the other from the state of Minnesota and others who believe that ICE was wholly in the wrong. But the reason for an investigation would be to, look into what happened and figure out what all went into it and determine if there was an actual violation of DHS policy or not.
Now, and I know this may not be a question you can answer fully because of, of course, um, attorney-client privilege, but uh you as an immigration attorney here in the state of Arkansas, where we have seen some, ICE, you could call them raids, and of course, it happens in every state, it seems like, but of course, here in the South, it definitely does. So, what are you seeing out there in the streets as far as, maybe some cases that you've kind of handled or things like that?
Well, generally in Arkansas, we have greater cooperation between the federal government and the state government as far as immigration enforcement actions are concerned. As I'm sure you're aware, it's state law now that all counties that manage a jail are to have 287G agreements with ICE and allow certain jail officials, typically through the sheriff's department, to be deputized agents of ICE and help pass detainees suspected of being present in the United States without authorization to ICE custody. And so you still see a lot of enforcement in Arkansas. It's a little bit more quiet because you see it going through those jail enforcement models or warrant service officer models as opposed to what you're seeing in Minnesota. But obviously, that's something that could come down the road. We don't know. I don't know that it was expected to happen in Minnesota until all of a sudden it flared up here within the last couple of weeks.
So just obviously the Minnesota thing is kind of its own separate issue rather than immigration, but and kind of again asking, immigration wise and with ICE here in Arkansas, have there been any problems that you've seen?
There've definitely been problems, and we've had confusions over individuals' identities who've been detained by ICE. We've had U.S. citizens who were detained by ICE. We've had U.S. citizens who've had holds placed on them by ICE, where attorneys have had to go in and try and clear up their identity or their, lack of an immigration status because they're U.S. citizens, but not because they're here and without authorization. We have certainly had people transferred out of state. It's fairly common when somebody's detained in Arkansas that they're transferred to one of the detention facilities all the way down in Louisiana. That caused a lot of stress for family members and friends as well as attorneys because, regular contact with their loved one or client who's detained 600 miles away can be very, very difficult.
Are you able to go into more detail about, some of that situations or some of those situations?
Probably not.
I got you. Well, yeah, hey, I
Some
had to
of
ask.
some of them have been my clients, some of them have been clients of other attorneys, and so I don't really want to speak too much on details if they're someone else's clients, and I don't necessarily have all of them. And as you correctly pointed out, I can't say too much about my clients either.
Well, I have to ask the question, so
No,
I
of course
might
you
as
do.
well. But
It's
yeah,
more than welcome. It's more
yeah.
than welcome because it does happen, and we've definitely had massive issues with ICE detaining lawful permanent residents who are not actually individuals who violated their status. And then ICE is not able to prove in immigration court that they violated their status. And so at the end of the day, we got our clients released. However, they've been detained sometimes for weeks or months and lost, job opportunities, lost that time with their family members, and suffered through conditions that are really not ideal. These ICE detention facilities are not what I would describe as the highest quality um, prison conditions.
I can imagine. Now, again, out in these communities with the people that you've spoken to, even if they're not, an immigrant, even if they've been a lifelong Arkansan or a lifelong American, I imagine and you can disagree with me if I'm wrong, but I imagine there's a little bit of fear out there.
I don't think you're wrong at all. I think there is fear. I think that when you have a dialogue with immigrant communities and with communities of color in general, because right or wrong, I think a lot of times we associate immigrants with being people of color, especially when you talk about undocumented immigration. I think that there is fear, and I think that fear is justified. Again, in Arkansas, we see greater collaboration between the state government and the federal government. And so some of the actions are a little bit more quiet, but that doesn't mean that there's not cases of mistaken identity. And that doesn't mean that you have people who are unfairly targeted specifically because of their race or ethnic background. And so when I talk to people, I've definitely been asked a lot of questions about, whether U.S. citizens should carry their passports around with them at all times or their birth certificates, whether permanent residents should carry their green cards with them at all times. Just what can people do to avoid a case of mistaken identity or being unlawfully taken into custody? Because while there may be a solution if somebody is unlawfully taken into custody, it can take days or weeks to get that figured out. And again, that's a major imposition on any individual or their family members when they're detained in that type of scenario.
I understand. Um, well, I had a question that left my mind, but is there anything else that you would like to add?
I don't think so. I'm going to keep it to your questions. I mean, this is definitely a fraught issue, as you can tell. I think that the protests are probably going to continue. I think as long as communities feel threatened, they and their allies are probably going to continue to protest. Hopefully, things remain peaceful, but the government's taking a very, very aggressive stance, and I don't think that's helping matters at all, no matter where you fall on how the law should be enforced.
And I did just remember, it's a simple question. What changes do you think could be made, whether it's in Arkansas or throughout the United States, to maybe dispel some of that fear or maybe to dispel some of that confusion that you mentioned earlier?
That's a very simple question without a simple answer. But I think there's a lot of things. I think really. What a lot of people don't understand is that the law was changed in 1996 to essentially criminalize civil violations. And the Illegal Immigrant Responsibility and Immigration Reform Act of 1996, IRA, went into effect in 1997, really gave the government excessively broad powers to go after individuals and limited people's defenses to detention and deportation. That's been a big problem. What you haven't seen is administrations weaponize that law in the way that you're seeing the current administration weaponize ICE to enforce that law. Additionally, I think greater transparency would go a long way towards restoring trust and just, less collaboration between local law enforcement and immigration and customs enforcement would go a long way towards establishing trust in law enforcement with local communities as well. So I'd have to think about it.
Hmm.
Um, I'd have to think about it. A lot of people are just afraid to talk. They don't want
Of
additional
course.
spotlights on their situation,
Yeah.
even if they're here as U.S. citizens. Because, I mean, again, and that's one of the biggest problems. And when you see an ICE officer, and regardless of what someone's viewpoint is on the tape, when you see an ICE officer on tape shoot a U.S. citizen in the face, somebody who they're not supposed to have any enforcement authority over, people are going to be afraid to speak up because they see if they put themselves at odds with ICE, who knows what could happen.
Yeah. Well, when I was covering that Dover story, there were a lot of people that I finally found their social medias, and I was trying to get in touch with them. And I was talking to one person who I think was a state employee in Dardanelle, and it was like, they're wanting to talk, but they also don't want to because they're fearful. I mean, ICE obviously didn't do anything with them in Dover because, well, they all had the proper documentation to stay. And so even, with that, I understand. I mean, there's so much fear,